Hello, everyone. I'm still reading from the Lakota Way, Stories and Lessons for Living, Native American Wisdom on Ethics and Character by Joseph and Marshall III. This lesson will be on compassion. Without compassion, darkness would rule the world. Poverty, despair, and hopelessness caused by war, natural disaster, or indifference are as much a part of this life as harmony, success, and prosperity. At some point in our lives, most of us find ourselves in need of a place to sleep, money for rent, or simply the knowledge that someone cares. If you can't remember at least one such moment, you're more fortunate than most of us. Or perhaps you're only misleading yourself. The ability to feel compassion is to understand need. When need is not recognized and alleviated, our spirits sink into darkness. One summer in the mid-1950s, when I was 9, in a small town in the northern part of Rosebud Sioux Indian Reservation, there was a death in a Lakota family. An infant had died. On the day of the funeral, I accompanied my grandmother to the family's home above an old store in town. The parents were very poor and couldn't afford a casket or the services of a mortician. It was stifling hot that day, and not a breath of air moved in the small rooms the family occupied, though every window was propped open. On the kitchen table was a cardboard container, not much bigger than a shoebox, and lined with white crepe paper. In it was the body of the dead baby, dressed in its finest clothes. My first impression was that it was simply asleep. A few relatives and friends of the family were gathered in the sparsely furnished rooms. No one spoke as we entered. There was a painful, heavy silence. The baby's mother was someone I knew, a relative on my grandmother's side. As a matter of fact, dressed in black, she sat next to the table, guarding, it seemed, the tiny form in the makeshift casket. The older daughter, about my age, sat next to her mother. My grandmother took hands with each of them, then turned to me. "Take their hands," she instructed. So I did, very self-consciously. I took the hand of the mother, then the daughter. It was one of my first lessons in showing compassion. I stood next to my grandmother, who had taken a chair offered her as she quietly wiped away the tears sliding down her face with a white handkerchief. Years later, I realized she was not just consoling the family of the dead baby, but actually feeling their pain and loss and taking some of it, perhaps as much as possible, upon herself. That is compassion, simply and profoundly. The sharing of someone else's dilemma, pain, or loss. Caring enough to take some of the burden or provide relief so that the aggrieved or injured person does not have to bear it alone. Compassion is often the only remedy when something assaults our bodies and minds and causes our spirits to slip into darkness. No one is immune from affliction, and often enough we find ourselves unable to bear it alone. In all probability, no one can completely take away the pain of our despair or the grief of losing a loved one, but the fact that someone who's experienced the same loss mourns with us is comforting. The sense of comfort comes from the realization that we are not alone in our darkest hour. The physical act of taking their hands in the moment of grief, despair, or need is the outward manifestation of compassion. Often no words are or need to be spoken to coincide with that simple act because it speaks volumes. It says, "I've been there." It is an unfortunate fact of life that happily ever after does not occur often enough. On the other side of the ledger is the fortunate fact that compassion lives within most of us. Some of us are more willing to demonstrate it, but those who can't or won't should reassess themselves to determine whether they've been able to endure difficulties absolutely and entirely on their own. I know I haven't. Difficulties and problems are part of life, and they fall upon us individually and collectively. And sometimes the simple hope of compassion, without it being actively demonstrated, can get us through a hard time. Thank you for joining me with another story time with Auntie A. Thank you.